A little dose of arcade to home reality on Segaiden episode 90.
We went ahead and threw the switch and sent Magellan on its way.
Sega shipped the Genesis hardware in America with a free copy of Altered Beast, presenting consumers with a powerful and compelling message. Here is a machine capable of almost perfectly recreating one of the coolest looking contemporary arcade machines with ease. But then you have Super Thunderblade, pulling back the veil of promises and mysteries to reveal the man behind the curtain. That was meant to be a Wizard of Oz illusion, but it kind of got away from me. Sorry about that. The original Thunderblade was, for me, the moment at which Master System more or less threw in the towel. Up until that point, the console had managed to fake Sega's arcade tech, including the superscalar boards, pretty well. Not convincingly exactly, but more confidently than any contemporary home system could manage, at least. But something about Thunderblade pushed the tech too far, to the point where the illusion broke down. I don't know how exactly, though the arcade machine's fluid perspective shifting, seamlessly shifting from top-down to behind-the-chopper viewpoints, certainly didn't make things any easier for the console. Still, Sega pushed Thunderblade for Master System pretty hard, probably because every kid in the 80s wanted their own game based on the movie Blue Thunder. It's kind of hard to explain to anyone who has grown up in this era of proper licensing, but back in the 80s, intellectual property was a wild, free-for-all situation in video games. And someone at Sega saw Blue Thunder and said, this would be a pretty cool video game. And you know what? They were right. But Thunderblade was really remarkably brazen in going about it. Not only does it keep thunder in its title, the chopper you control looks almost exactly like the Apache Gazelle hybrid in the film. And maybe because of that, it became a pretty big arcade hit, and Sega eagerly converted it for home play. Despite their corporate-level enthusiasm for the Master System port, though, it really kind of marked the end of the golden age of arcade to Master System conversions, with future coin-op adaptations turning out more like, Altered Beast. But the Master System didn't have to go it alone. Its failure would surely be the Genesis's opportunity. And so when Sega launched their 16-bit console in Japan at the end of 1988, it shipped with 2 games, one of which was Super Thunderblade. At last, the title suggests, Thunderblade, done right, or maybe even better. Surely that's what the super means. Well, no. As I've mentioned, the Genesis hardware more or less amounts to a scaled-down System 16 board. Powerful, but nowhere near as capable a machine as the X-Board arcade system where Thunderblade made its debut. The X-Board ran on 2 of the Motorola 68000 chips that singly powered the Genesis, and those chips were clocked at 12.5 MHz versus the 7.6 MHz of the Genesis CPU, which is to say nothing of the fact that Sega engineered the X-Board around dynamic sprite scaling, unlike with Genesis. So Super Thunderblade here seems almost calculated to throw the gulf in power between the console and coin-op tech into sharp relief. Now there's no question Super Thunderblade looks and plays a lot better than its Master System predecessor. The 8-bit game largely used that old trick of animating background tiles in order to render just about everything in the game outside of the player's helicopter, which means that everything that wasn't the chopper was simply choppy, including enemy projectiles. By contrast, Super Thunderblade renders most moving hazards as sprites, allowing them to animate more fluidly and giving you a better sense of their trajectories. The level of refinement is such that Sega's programmers felt empowered to add weight and inertia to the chopper's movements, giving it a sophisticated sensation of mass that would have been too frustrating to fully recreate on Master System. However, this console still lacks proper sprite scaling, so the game renders objects as a series of individual sprites presented at different sizes. There's still a stop-start jumpiness to the motion and zoom effects of everything in the world, even if it doesn't feel nearly as stultifying as it did on Master System. This really plays out in the environments. Thunderblade sent players hurtling through dense urban canyons and actual canyons, where enemies could pop out and attack unexpectedly from between buildings and structures. In Super Thunderblade, environmental layouts look comparatively sparse, and they still suffer from a sputtering sensation of jump scaling. Since you can crash into the scenery, the ragged animation really detracts from the game experience by making it very hard to predict exactly where obstacles exist in space and how they scale relative to your chopper. This isn't too troublesome in the first stage, but once you clear the first set of bosses, Super Thunderblade kinda falls apart. Stage 2 appears to be set around a series of mountains that you fly through via caves, but the Genesis just doesn't sell this concept at all. You begin Stage 2 in the open air, but eventually you reach a set of stone arches that you need to pass through, at which point the background color changes and the environment becomes dense with stone columns. In the original Thunderblade, this illusion worked a little more convincingly as the transition was masked entirely behind a butte wall that spanned the width of the screen. And the smoother motion and scaling allowed the ground lines along the cavern floor to move in sync with the scaling columns. Here, not so much, which becomes all the more frustrating in the second phase when you have to try to dodge stalactites hanging from the ceiling, which don't line up with any corresponding environmental motion elements and whose position relative to the chopper is incredibly hard to judge. It doesn't help that the chopper and the stone elements appear to have hitboxes that extend well beyond their visible edges, and will sometimes register a collision even if visually you appear to have safely maneuvered around a barrier. Don't get me wrong, this was incredible looking stuff for a console game in 1989, but it still feels undeniably rough compared to the source material, making this, again, a bit of a no-sell for the promise of true arcade conversions on Genesis. This is no Altered Beast, is what I'm saying, which is a pretty rude thing to say about any video game. Super Thunderblade also streamlines its levels somewhat by dropping the opening top-down sections and getting straight to the 3D effect. Just as well, since the top-down scenes lack the impressive superscalar diorama effect, so that you're just flying over a flat sheet of terrain rather than hovering above immersive backgrounds. I feel like I can't be too hard on Super Thunderblade because this was, again, pretty jaw-dropping to see on a console in 1989. Sega's programmers were getting a handle on a brand new piece of hardware here. Super Thunderblade was produced internally by the R&D 2 console development team under Yuji Naka, not the company's arcade division, and the credited staff on the game didn't have any published experience with 68,000-based architecture before this that I'm aware of. And hey, if nothing else, this appears to be the first appearance in the US of one of the trademark visual gimmicks of the 16-bit era, converging text displays. The credits and options on high-score table screens don't feature scaling text characters, but the game fakes it by pulling scattered text inward toward the center from all directions, a visual trick that would appear endlessly on 16-bit machines. Anyway, it's okay, I guess, but playing through Super Thunderblade makes me realize that Nintendo took aim directly at this game when they launched the Super NES. Pilot Wings would not only feature actual scaling through hardware effects, the game's final secret mission plays like an amped-up rendition of Super Thunderblade's top-down sequences, all the way to the cheap, untelegraphed attacks taking you out from off-screen. Begun the 16-bit wars have. But who really fired the first shot in this conflict, Welcome back, my friends, to the fantasy zone that never ends. Wait, that's ELP, not Genesis. The Genesis launched in the US with a healthy 6 games in tow. That's nowhere near as many as we saw with the NES, admittedly, but given that the two consoles arrived under very different circumstances, I think we can forgive the more modest scale. In Japan, on the other hand, the Mega Drive debuted in stores with only 2 games for consumers to pick from. That's actually kind of par for the course for Japanese launches, as it turns out. The Super Famicom would also arrive with a 2-game library in 1990, and Sega had kicked off the Mark III with Hang On and Teddy Boy Blues back in 1985. But Mega Drive stumbled a bit when it provided only 2 titles at launch, both of which were fundamentally more or less the same game. Super Thunderblade was a follow-up to a home console conversion of a third-person forward-scaling shooter, and Mega Drive's second launch title, Space Harrier II, was also a follow-up to a home console conversion of a third-person forward-scaling shooter. Okay, so they aren't literally the same game. Super Thunderblade has its unique top-down sequences, and Space Harrier II plays much faster, lacking the inertia of the other game's attack chopper. But fundamentally, Sega doubled down on superscalar combat and said, "This is it, folks. This is our new console." That actually makes perfect sense for a company that had invested so much of its identity into its arcade tech. But I think it speaks to a misreading of the market at the time. Japan's console market in late 1988 revolved around RPGs and baseball games, while not exactly painting the new console in the best light. The Genesis hardware could fake a mean System 16 conversion, but Space Harrier and Thunderblade demanded more oomph than the console could muster. These may have been the best-looking superscalar home conversions anyone had ever seen, but they still fell short of port perfection. Of the two, though, Space Harrier II holds up much better to scrutiny. The combination of zippier action, surreal environments, and a lower-to-the-ground perspective makes this a far more convincing ersatz superscalar game. Which, in fact, it literally is, ersatz. The Space Harrier II never actually ran on superscalar hardware. It's a console-exclusive sequel to the arcade game, a wholly original title. Well, for a certain value of wholly original. There's not really that much you can do with the Space Harrier toy box, so for all intents and purposes, this could just as well have been a port of the original game with remixed boss battles. It doesn't introduce new mechanics, such as alternate weapons or charge shots or anything along those lines. You streak forward into a checkerboard landscape, dodging or shooting scenery and enemies as they zoom towards you, evading enemy fire, and pausing at the end of each stage to take out a sub-boss and main boss. So the new material here amounts to revamped visuals, different enemy patterns and scenery arrangements, and a more varied selection of bosses. A remix of Space Harrier, more or less, but a different remix than Space Harrier 3D for Master System. And it's a pretty good remix. Space Harrier II features greater visual variety than the original game, and the environments are both prettier and less eye-searing. The action on Genesis feels fast and relentless, and the faux scaling is far smoother than it had been in the Master System port, and less frustrating than you saw in Super Thunderblade. Of the two games, Space Harrier II offers the more convincing demonstration of Genesis's ability to recreate arcade-caliber experiences, which might come as a bit of a surprise, since it doesn't seem like Yuji Naka applied his technical wizardry to this one. Yet the fine details make all the difference. Space Harrier II may lack true sprite scaling, but every visual element is rendered with more level of detail steps than anything you saw in Super Thunderblade. It also has absolutely incredible draw distance, if that's what we want to call the way tiny little blobs appear on the horizon and your Harrier's projectiles take seemingly forever to fully wink out of view if they fly wide of obstacles or targets. The checkerboard ground tiles scroll past with manic speed, but when you rise and descend, the floor changes up its animation cycle to create a sensation of pitching at different angles. In several stages, a ceiling appears overhead that, unlike the blank void in Super Thunderblade, uses tile animation to create an enveloping sensation of speed. And the bosses make use of a wide variety of tactics, but never overstay their welcome. Sega brought their A-game for this one, creating the most impressive faux superscalar world yet, all of which makes sense. Where Super Thunderblade was Genesis's attempt to convert a current, cutting-edge arcade release to console, Space Harrier II sees the company building on a crucial foundation of its own heritage. Although Hang On was technically the moment that Sega leapt from comparative obscurity to become a leading arcade powerhouse, that's not how the company tends to recount its history. Hang On and its ride-on coin-op system may have been an arcade sensation, but the company ultimately treats Space Harrier as the inflection point of its rise to greatness. I think this speaks to how Sega sees its legacy, not just as tech pioneers, but as purveyors of surprising, unique works. Hang On looked and played great, but in the end it was a realistic bike racing game with cool graphics and a fun optional interface gimmick. Space Harrier, on the other hand, looked like nothing else at the time. Its surrealistic setting, bizarre enemies, and unconventional color schemes arguably created the 3D vaporwave style that many people associate with the 80s, even though life in the actual 80s was a dreary slog through dull earth tones left over from the 70s. Not Space Harrier, though. This series is the weirdo sci-fi madness that Sega wants to wrap itself in. And Space Harrier II does a great job of conveying that and setting the tone for the new generation, just as the Space Harrier BIOS demo had set the tone for the Japanese Master System. It looks great, sounds great, and plays great. While I don't love Super Thunderblade, Space Harrier II offers a strong showcase of Genesis's potential. Honestly, I don't know if it's possible to relay the true impact that this game had in 1989 or 1988 in Japan. We take 3D visuals for granted now, and smooth as Space Harrier II looks by Genesis standards, You can see the seams and shortcomings pretty readily today. But back in 1989, throw this game up on a big CRT, a decent 17 or 19-incher, like would have been the standard family room TV set at the time. Turn off the lights, crank up the sound. The furious speed and screen-filling action, the bleak electronic soundscape, the vivid pastels overlaid with bold, high-contrast 3D text, the enthusiastic voice samples. This was the Genesis game to show off to your friends. Slick, fast, stable 3D action, and all in the form of an original title rather than a straight arcade conversion. Space Harrier II may not have been quite as awesome as a true superscalar title would have been, but anyone who had the opportunity to streak through this stunning shooter in the comfort of their own home couldn't complain. So it feels almost miserly to say that it could have been better, but it could, and that's not unreasonable to say. In fact, it's been scientifically proven. When M2 built the Genesis Mini 2 microconsole for Sega, they fooled around, like they always do, and created something they call the Mark V, a virtual console environment that asked the question, what if the Genesis actually had been given the power to scale sprites like the arcade boards did? And they built this theoretical spec entirely for the sake of creating an enhanced port of Space Harrier II. Space Harrier II for Mark V can't run on a real Genesis, and it doesn't look as good as it would if M2 had backported it to actual arcade hardware the way they did with Fantasy Zone 2. But it's pretty impressive all the same, and its existence demonstrates how potently this game captured the imaginations of the Sega faithful back in the early Genesis and Mega Drive days. I mean, sure, Sega probably shouldn't have min-maxed on scaling shooters for the Japanese launch, and the console's soft sales versus Super Famicom and PC Engine might well have begun here. But don't let that supposition, or the existence of a smoother, sleeker rendition, obscure the fact that in 1988 and 89, this was the console gaming state-of-the-art, a $50 cartridge that brought home sights and sounds that previously had been unimaginable. The Genesis begins here in earnest. And like the man says, get ready. Next time on Segaiden, the pasta and the imposter.